Mike McAllister. You can see him tonight on the TV version of Orange Nation. Mike, it's great to have you on. How was the weekend?
It was good after Friday night.
Yeah. So let's talk about Friday night. I guess let's go right to the very end of the game. I mean, I feel like we have to start on the 4th and 9. Are you surprised that they chose not to double team Stanford's NFL wide receiver?
I'm surprised that they didn't have some sort of rolled coverage to him or double team or something. And I'm surprised that they elected in that moment to only rush 3 and not bring an extra rusher or 2, because it seemed like as the second half went along, the more they pressured Ashton Daniels, then the more inaccurate and inconsistent he was. And especially in that last drive, I felt like they got to the 4th and 9 in part because they were bringing blitzers from other spots and helping to get some quick pressure on him, and that led to being in the 4th and 9 situation to begin with. So you get into that critical situation where if you make the stop, you win. If they get a first down, they're likely at least going to have a field goal attempt to win on their end, and you don't bring pressure, which you had been doing well, and you don't, bracket or double cover or something their best wide receiver. Yeah, I think it's certainly worth questioning. Now, the other side of that is I don't know enough about what their coverage had been the rest of the second half to know if what they showed on that play was consistent with what it had been the rest of the half, because for most of the rest of the second half, he had been pretty quiet. I know he was pretty active early, but they had done a much better job on him throughout most of the second half. So perhaps it was, hey, this has been working, let's stick with it. I don't know specifically enough about what their coverage had been the rest of the half.
Another hot topic of discussion has been the offensive line. And, you look at the fact that they gave up 4 sacks in the first half, didn't give up a sack after halftime. Was that a case of, did you feel like the offensive line played better in the second half, or was it a case of, Kyle McCord played better in the second half, and so he was able to, to cover up maybe some of the mistakes that the O-line made? How would you assess, I guess, the O-line in the first half versus the second half?
Well, the first half, they were terrible.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no ifs, ands, or buts about that. There's no way around it. They just weren't good. Kyle McCord was under constant pressure. He had virtually no time, and they couldn't open up a hole for the rushing attack to get going, even in the second half. So from that perspective, the offensive line as a run-blocking offensive line didn't really show much improvement as far as what I saw, maybe a little bit in the second half, but nothing really significant. As far as pass protection, I thought it was a little bit better, but I also thought that the coaching staff did a good job of adjusting in terms of some quicker routes, some rollouts, some things like that, and then Kyle McCord also adjusting in terms of his ability to see where the pass rush is coming and try to escape it. So I think there were multiple factors into why there weren't any sacks in the second half.
Are you concerned at all about the run game? It really was non-existent in this game, and they ran the ball at times against Ohio and Georgia Tech, but we really haven't seen them go to that. Now, McCord's been great, right? Aside from really the first half against Stanford, but are you starting to get concerned about the run game?
Yes, because you're not going to be able to throw the ball 40 times and have Kyle McCord throw for 350 to 400 yards and win every game. And they did that, and they didn't win this last game. And that was in part because there wasn't any offensive balance. And you need to have that, not only just to put up points, not only just to rack up yards, but also to control clock, because Stanford held the ball longer than Syracuse did in this game, also to give your defense a rest. There's a lot of factors here in why this is an important thing for Syracuse to get going, but they struggled in the first half against Ohio running the ball. They struggled in the first half against Georgia Tech running the ball, got better as those games went along, but weren't able to do so against Stanford. So I think we're all still kind of waiting where they have that one game where they really run the ball well throughout an entire 60 minutes.
What does this loss mean for the season? Paulie and I were kind of touching on that in the first segment. It's unfortunate, it's frustrating, but there's still a lot on the table for this team. How do you kind of put in perspective what this loss means?
I don't think that it has the potential to not mean anything. But part of it depends on what happens the rest of the season. Now, we talked about this on the pregame show Friday, Steve, that we know Syracuse is going to beat Holy Cross, right? They could basically play their backups and their walk-ons and win that game pretty comfortably. So you expect that they're going to go into that game, they're going to blow Holy Cross out, and we're not going to know all that much. But then things, you've got the UNLV game and the NC State game, and you've got some, with those road games and some tougher opponents coming up, we're going to learn how much this means. Because if they adjust and they learn from it and they end up winning, their next 3 or 4 games, then I don't think it ended up meaning much in terms of what the season could be as a whole. If they beat Holy Cross and then they lose UNLV and at NC State, and you're sitting at 3-3, I think that changes a lot. And I think you would point back to this moment where, they just played about as bad as they could for a large chunk of a game against an opponent that they should beat, lost a game that they shouldn't have, and that sort of derailed things a little bit.
I know that Syracuse is not in the business of moral victories. Do you take any positives away from this game, like the way that, I was talking to Paulie and I said, last year they probably lose that game by, double figures or, 2-3 scores. Do you take anything away from the way they kept their composure, the way they fought back, the way they pulled ahead, or does none of that matter because of the outcome?
I think all of that stuff matters. I don't want to say you can't take anything positive just because they lost a game that we all expected that they wouldn't. I don't think that's fair. What I take positive from this game is, in order for Syracuse to lose this game on a last-second field goal where you could still make the argument they maybe should have won based on how things played out at the end, they had to turn the ball over twice. They had to have their offensive line have easily its worst performance of the season and maybe of the last couple of seasons. They had to have, Kyle McCord had to make some questionable decisions, and they had to have a bunch of penalties, in bad spots, which we hadn't seen in the first 2 games. And despite all of that, offense never really getting into rhythm, the defense coming up with some stops, but, then the offense isn't able to take advantage of the turnovers that the defense gets. Despite all of that, they were able to fight back and take a lead with 3 minutes to go and get into a situation where they needed to make a stop on one play and would have come away with a win. So what that tells me is I still think that this is a good football team. I still think that there's a lot of potential for this team to have a really good season, and I'm not ready to just quit on what we saw in the first 2 games and what Fran Brown is building just because they had a loss.
You brought up the word penalties. Let me ask you about that. We saw some uncharacteristic penalties for this particular team. I know they're just 3 games in, but we thought that, from a discipline standpoint, things were improving, and I still believe that, by the way. But there was, the odd personal foul on Aronde Gadsden on the punt. There was a roughing the passer that kept the drive alive. That would have, been a punt. Instead, Stanford keeps the ball, goes down, kicks a field goal. Some uncharacteristic penalties in this one. Is it just kind of like a one-off, like, those things are going to happen here or there, or any cause for concern in that area?
I don't think it's a cause for concern because it wasn't an issue in the first 2 games, and I think there were a couple of those penalties that you could question. The roughing the passer penalty that extended the drive, I question that. The holding call on Aronde Gadsden that took a big play away that would have put Syracuse, I believe, in a first and goal situation inside the 10 with the ability to take a lead. And I think a couple of plays later, if I'm not mistaken, was when the pick 6 happened. So to me, the way I look at this is, given what I've seen in the first 2 games, this seems to be the anomaly. And there's a couple of things here. One, even teams that are really disciplined and don't commit a lot of penalties have a game or 2 during the season where they kind of go the opposite way and they commit a lot of penalties and have some disciplinary issues. Number 2, this is still a team with a lot of the players that are out there that have had disciplinary and penalty issues in years past, and it's still difficult to get out of some of those habits. And so that can creep up a couple of times when you're trying to change the culture and change how things go. So I'm not overly concerned about it right now, but I will be if they have a bunch of penalties against Holy Cross.
All right, and with that being said, let's look ahead to Holy Cross. You said they could win this game with their backups and walk-ons. I agree with you. Can they get anything out of this one other than just going out, taking care of business, and moving on to the next?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing they can get out of it is trying to establish something on the ground and feeling like the ground game is maybe taking a step forward, because this is a game where you feel like if you decide to step back, to drop back and pass the ball 55, 60 times, like Kyle McCord could set a single game record at Syracuse for most passing yards. But I think we all know as long as the offensive line gives Kyle McCord a decent amount of time, they're going to be able to throw the ball. They're going to be able to move the ball through the air. The biggest question right now, as we previously discussed, is whether or not they can get a ground game to complement that. And so I think going into this game against an FCS-level opponent, I think you want to come out and try to establish the ground game and give yourself some good feelings going into kind of the meat of your schedule.
All right. We look forward to seeing you at Channel 9 tonight. Mike, great insight as always, and we'll see you later tonight.
All right. Sounds good. Thanks, guys.
All right. Mike McAllister joining us on McAllister Mondays on the show. We're going to take a break. Fran Brown's press conference coming up at 1 o'clock. We'll wrap up hour number 1 next on ESPN Radio.